Another theme is the gap between vision and execution. You touched on that as well. Europe has deep grassroots talent. The kernel community is heavily based here. Even Greg KH moved to Europe, but US companies seem to dominate in releasing and commercializing open source. What do you see as the biggest barrier holding back wider adoption right now?
I would, I think that's a super important question. I would argue, I would slightly rephrase it in the sense, I don't know that it's necessarily just hampering open source adoption, but I do think there's a couple of key barriers, which I also touched in my keynote at Open Source Summit, um, as to how Europe can leverage strategically open source. Look, in terms of adoption, if you look at surveys, depending on which survey you look at, open source makes up 80 to 95% of every application that is written nowadays. And that is largely, independent of the region. The adoption, so the consumption of open source, the usage of open source, whether it's recognized or not, whether it's acknowledged or not, is there, and it's independent of the region. Where I do think, though, going back to this sort of gap, is the recognition of how to effectively leverage open source for strategic purposes. And so when I think about the strategic goals of Europe, whether it be digital sovereignty, whether it be growing its relevance in technology, in what has largely been over the last few years, everyone talks about US and China, and their investment in, especially in the wave of AI. I think Europe has a couple of key sort of barriers. As you say, it's not the lack of talent. It's not the lack of grassroots contributions. But I think if I can pinpoint to two of them, one is the lack of a commercial ecosystem that is scalable and provide incredible alternatives to some of the large commercial open source players that are born out of Europe. I was on a panel about 2 months ago with three founders, commercial open source founders. They're all Europeans, but they all then moved to the US in seek of a better funding climate and of a better exit climate. So one of the key outcomes, and this is actually proven in our commercial open source report, but I think the first big point is that there is not enough investment in a commercial ecosystem that ultimately can build products and services in open source. Because if you think about it, that's how consumption of open source happens in the most cases, especially in enterprise context, especially in governmental context. They need someone to support or service the customer, if that makes sense. I think that's one big point, the lack of funding from a VC or from other sources. The second one is, if you look at the contribution in terms of labor or in terms of financial contribution to open source, it was estimated to be about 7.7 billion globally to open source from the enterprise world. But if you then cross-reference this with, for example, the Open Source Contributor Index, you see that there's no European large organizations in the top 10. I think there's 2 in the top 20 contributors to open source, which goes to the second point, which is that lack of strategic C-suite understanding of open source means that some of the large traditional industries that exist in Europe have not yet invested, again, both in labor, in terms of contributors, or in terms of support financial to maintainers, to foundations, in the same way that you see in other regions. In the US, largely driven by private companies. In China, largely driven by the public sector, if that makes sense. And so I think those two elements makes it so that, yes, there is a amazing grassroots and amazing innovation is produced in Europe, but the value gets then extracted somewhere else. And that creates doesn't allow the virtuous circle to create, especially in the topic, I think, of digital sovereignty.